Greetings, First Baptist. Welcome to our 4th of July service. I am putting the message up on our Facebook and YouTube channel, and it will be played tomorrow morning. And I'll let Carolyn run the service, and she'll be giving you a lot of very important announcements. So I want you to pay attention to what's going on in the church, and I love you all. I don't know if any of you know this, but I was originally born in Scotland, immigrated to Canada, and in 1983, I came down to the United States, and I love this country. It is my home. I have had an opportunity to travel to all 50 states, and I hope that my learnings will be helpful for you. I believe this is a great country, and I love to call it home. I remember the first time I traveled back from an overseas trip into the airport and showed them my passport and everything else. And it was really an amazing experience to hear them say, "Welcome home." Well, today I want to talk about America, and the theme is America yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I'm going to be taking you to a passage in Scripture that I know you'll enjoy. It's 1 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 32. This is the passage where David is choosing his mighty men. And a text that we're reading says, "From Issachar, men who understood the times and knew what to do." That is the two great questions for us as individual Christians and as a church. Do we understand our times, and do we know what it is we should do? And it is important for us to understand that when you're in a battle, strategy is critical. When you're in a field of wheat, you don't use a corn picker. Both in the farming and in the real world, strategy is critical. And knowing the fight we're in and the nature of the enemy shapes what we do. And we are in a new world, and gaining understanding of what we should do in it are very important. Now, the world is changing right before our eyes. I have coined this phrase, we're often living in a scratch-your-head world. We wonder what is happening, what is going on, and we want to just scratch our heads. And the role of Christians in our culture has been changing over the last years. And we have gone in America from being one of the largest Christian nations in the world to becoming one of the largest mission fields in the world. And depending on how you count, we have gone and become either the third or the second largest mission field of unreached people anywhere on the globe. And while not all the questions about the future, what we should do is really a question of what is God directing us to do, knowing that He will lead us and guide us. Now, being a Christian in today's world is different. That's a fact. And how much of the world is in us is a question. Now, Jesus has asked us all to be world changers and history makers. That is the demand that is put on us, and it is still binding. Now, in America today, the percentage of people who say they have no belief in God, no religious affiliation, what are classified in our surveys as nones, has doubled in the last decade. And nationally now, 17% of people worship in a Christian church weekly. And in certain regions of the country, and California would be classified as one of those regions, it's under 10%. We as Christians in culture are a minority. And so what I want to do is give you a little bit of history of America and understanding how Christianity in culture has changed. I want to start you off by looking at America and from the years 1607 to 1833. And America's beginning was seeing God as central to culture. The original seeds of America found Christianity as the established religion of the society. In fact, if you were to go back east and travel and look at many of the early churches, you found out the government paid and built the churches. You find out that up until 1833, the government paid the salaries of pastors and priests. Did you know, and this is humorous to a point, but it is the truth, a man could be fined the equivalent of a day's wages if for other than illness he was not in church attendance on Sunday. And the last government payment to support a church or pastor was in Massachusetts in 1833, approximately 50 years following the birth of the nation in 1776. In 1776 through about 1833, there started to be a weakening of could be found as being one form of Christianity or another. Because what actually happened in America early on was this. What you found is that the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church was the established religion, but people like Judson and others wanted additional forms of worship, and so we find out that the doctrine of the separation of church and state began not where America would have no religion, but America would have a choice of religion. And the vast majority, and when I say the vast majority, it was 90% of people attended church every week. And that trend continued until we get to about 1918, to the close of the First World War. And from the end of the First World War until 1968, Christianity became subdominant, still very strong, but it was no longer the dominant. You see, Christian values at the end of the First World War started to wane. And the influence of European excesses started to have an impact. Some of you may remember an era called the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties, where the excesses started to come in of drinking and the backlash of the Prohibition movement and all of that, were really values and mores brought back from Europe by our soldiers returning. And this was the first era where less than 50% of the population stopped attending church. And what you notice is sin began to be redefined. In this era, some dramatic changes started to occur. For example, John Kennedy was assassinated. The 1960s, at the end of this era, was the most violent decade in American history. You had the Kent State riots, the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And this subdominant culture saw some rising things that you might remember. The God is dead, the church is irrelevant movement rose. Many denominations, including the American Baptists, of which this church at one point was a part, shrunk by between 30 and 60%. And this is the first time where there were fewer churches serving the population than there were population. It's interesting to notice that we went from having one church for every 900 people to one church for about every 2,000 people. And using church membership as a reference point was eliminated. And people now started to talk about how large is your church, and we started to give an attendance number. And the start of moral drift can be seen in a popular song of that decade, Blowin' in the Wind. You found the rise of organizations that began to emerge like the Moral Majority and focus on society, because the effects on society seem to be destroying our culture. And what it was a reaction of still a subdominant culture to many of the core beliefs they had being taken away from them. Now, when we reached 1968 and went to 1998, the redefining of sin became commonplace, and the sense of a conscience for right and wrong began to erode. You had the sexual revolution. It was no longer called adultery. It was called having an affair. It was softened. We redefined it. There was no stigma attached to sin. This was the era in which truth was no longer seen as absolute, and music started to reflect the despair. Some of you may remember the old song, A Horse with No Name. That was America in the counterculture from 1988 to 1998, and what it was a period in which the church began to lose its influence. And the cultural influences became a louder voice. By the time we reached 1998, you find that Christianity was now antithetical to culture. And that has occurred until 2014. Some of you may remember Columbine. Columbine shocked and changed the nation. And Cassie Bernall was one of the people mentioned who was killed for her faith. And she became known as the first martyr of a person for their Christian faith since 1542 on American soil, where a priest, Juan Padilla, was found his life taken as a result of spreading the gospel to the Indians in Kansas. And the influence of the church in culture waned. And this waning of influence has allowed the rise of many non-Christian factors that we are battling with today. Now, from the year 2014 in this antithetical culture to the present, people like Jim Garlow and others talk about America having entered a persecuted culture. Some of you may have faced that persecution at work, where your voice of witness has been silenced. We have found it in California, where the government has taken the Bibles out of public schools and public libraries. 8 of 10 evangelical Christians, when asked the question, believe they have been persecuted for their faith position, and they view their life as being out of step with the majority. There are many political moves designed to undermine and eliminate churches and other religious groups. And freedom of religion has now been reinterpreted to meaning we need to be free from religion. And the effect of the waning of the church influence and its teachings is being felt. And the social mores of our age, many of us could openly say they are non-Christian. In America, many of the people no longer believe that God is essential to their life, while 80% of Americans say they believe in a higher power or God, what you find out, 56% don't believe in the God of the Bible and that mankind is sinful and needs to have a relationship with God. So when we look at the culture of America, which has gone from predominantly as an established religion to a predominant religion to a subdominant religious group to now antithetical and persecuted, how do we respond? Here we are in America, 2020, July the 4th, trying to say, what does it all mean to us? Well, some Christians are fighters. They want to stand in opposition to the culture. Some people have compromised and capitulated to culture. Some see the church as being above the world and we ought to just avoid it. Some see the church as in the world and they try to compromise and make sense with it. But some, and I would suggest the churches that are making a difference, see the church as in the world and transforming it. Billy Graham, who many of you have heard of, was part of the culture that started to shift. And he made the point that the church should be engaged, yet transcend culture. We can be engaged in the culture, but not transform it or transcend it. And we can transcend the culture, but not be engaged in it. But we as a church need to engage the culture we live in, but yet give hope that there is something better than what our culture offers. As a missiologist, I can tell you that that's what happened in Korea, where it went from 3% Christian to more than 50% Christian in a generation. The church gave a message to the culture that was so great that it literally transcended the culture, and they lived out their life in such a way that people said, that's the kind of life that I want. Now, at this point, I want to share my screen with you because I want you to see something that I think you'll find very, very, very helpful. Here is a picture. And in this picture, I want to ask you the question, what is it that you see? What is it that you see? I would like to go on to the next slide and have you look at that as well. Here is a second picture of the first slide. What is it that you see? Well, what you're looking at here is the Choluteca Bridge. The Choluteca Bridge. And what you will find is that this bridge was a phenomenal feat of engineering. During Hurricane Mitch, the hurricane was so strong that the river moved. And the Choluteca Bridge was found to be a magnificent feat of engineering. In fact, even after the hurricane, the Japanese company who built that bridge put the bridge on their advertising stating that our bridge could stand the effect of Hurricane Mitch. But yet the reality was very, very simple. The hurricane moved the river. The hurricane moved the river. And that was a phenomenal fact. And I left this slide up before I go back to say that many times as a church, we're the bridge. but the river has moved. And somewhere along the line, we have lost our understanding of how to engage our culture. And we have been what is sometimes called red ocean focus. And what we are doing is we are finding out that perhaps what we're offering as legacy churches, churches that have been around for a while, the community is not buying. But I want to say two things to you. There is nothing better for America than more people becoming Christians. Nothing more for America that would be better than people becoming Christians. That is what is called rise and lift. When you became a Christian, certain things in your values shifted. You love to tell the truth. You love to be kind. You love to keep your family together. All of these values came as a result of Christianity lifting you. Donald McGavran made the point that there's nothing better. There's nothing better for a society than more people becoming Christians. And so as a church, we need to stop thinking stay. Will you all stay in church? Or would you all come to church? And start thinking about Jesus and the words of his message to his disciples to engage culture of go. Now, I want to share this screen with you again that I think you'll find very, very helpful. This is called blue ocean and red ocean. This phenomena has been discussed in marketing and in the church for the last number of years. And you'll notice in the red ocean, you will see all these shark fins, but yet you will see very, very few in the blue ocean. The red ocean is red because the sharks are feeding. They are hungry. Now what we do is we take a look at the picture of the red ocean and the blue ocean. The red ocean has all of these boats in it trying to catch fish. And the blue ocean, there's a lonely fisherman out there. Now this became a picture of the church. This became a picture of the church. We quite often in the church are fishing in the red ocean. And what that means is we are competing for the people who are already churched. But in this community, 90% of the people are in the blue ocean. And we're not here to compete with the other churches in community for those who are already saved, the red ocean. We are here in partnership with God to reach people who are part of that blue ocean. And folks, when we look at the city of Taft, 90% of all the people who don't attend any church, that's who we have the opportunity to serve. And so we are living in a mission field. And like the fisherman who knows there are lots of fish in an area because there have been very little people fishing there, we too have an opportunity that has never been greater. And the unrest in our world creates disconcerting, to be sure, but creates wonderful opportunities. America's founding dream is fragile. America's founding dream is fragile. And when we lose our understanding of what it means to be one nation under God, what we will do is we will find other laws, other mores, and other values that will control us. And I want to encourage you, our country is in need today of God's intervention. And in a world that has left its mooring pole, it becomes more and more important that for you and I, our life become the message for the society in which we live. So what does July 4th mean to you and me today? Well, it first of all means that July 4th means my personal freedom is not the most important freedom I have. It is my spiritual freedom. And the relationship I have with my Heavenly Father is the most important of all relationships. I want to encourage you, if you don't have that relationship, I want to encourage you to develop it this day. If you know that your life is not right with God, if you will acknowledge that and believe that Jesus Christ can give you hope, can give you freedom, can give you forgiveness of sins, and you'll commit your life to Him, this July 4th will have a new meaning for you. And if we are already Christians and we lose our mooring, that connection we have with our Heavenly Father is the most important relationship of all, we too will start to drift. And I want to give you a challenge that is very, very important. I want you to honestly answer this question. Are you honestly today more in love with Jesus than you were 6 months or 6 years ago? Can you look back in a time in your life when you were more in love with Jesus than you are today? If that is true, would you do something with me? Would you make a commitment? Would you make a commitment that what you're going to do is you're going to make a goal that 6, 7, 8 months from now, at the end of the year, if this question is asked to you again, would you be able to say, I'm more in love with Jesus at the end of 2020 than I was on July 4th, 2020? Folks, I just want to encourage you that I believe that the dream of America to be one nation under God is the future of America. That premise is what drives us as a church to see more and more people develop a relationship with God. For there is nothing better for our culture and our society than more people become Christians. And so I want to encourage you this July 4th. Would you enjoy the time with your family? And God bless you. you can check either your email or you can Greetings, church. It is the 4th of July weekend, and this is Pastor Bob, and I have the 4th of July message for you that I am putting up here on the web for us today, and I hope you'll join us as we look forward to celebrating together. Tomorrow at church, this video will be shown, and Carolyn has some important announcements for you. And I want to just give you the message here, and it will be played tomorrow. I want to talk about America yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Some of you may know the story, but I was not born in the United States. I am an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Scotland, brought up in Canada, and in 1983 came down to the United States. And I love living here. I love being part of this great country. And perhaps I love it more than many people who've grown up in the country, as they take for granted many of the blessings that are here. I remember the first time I traveled back from an overseas trip and the joy I had walking through immigration coming home and hearing the immigration officer say, "Welcome home." I have America as my home and I love this country, and I want to share my concerns and some history about the country that I think will be very, very helpful during this 4th of July weekend. I want to take you first of all to Colossians chapter 12, verse 32. Colossians chapter 12, verse 32 is a very important verse. David is choosing his mighty men, and he was going to be in a major battle with Saul, as well as other foes in his reign. And it is said in 1 Chronicles 12:32, from Issachar, men who understood the times and who knew what Israel needed to do. David was looking for people who were smart, who understood the culture, the times in which they lived, and knew what to do about it. As I looked at this text, there are 3 simple insights that I would give to you. When you know you're in a battle, the strategy and the correct strategy is critical. I have lived around farms a lot of my life. You don't go into a field of wheat with a corn picker. You can be in a harvest field, but you won't get any harvest. And the strategy, the tools to use are critical. Now, if you know the fight you're in and the nature of your enemy, then you'll know what kind of things you need to do. And I believe that we are today in our culture in a new world, and we need to gain understanding of what is important. I believe we're living in what I have termed a scratch your head world. Any of you ever looked at things that are going on and you find yourself just scratching your head? Because what you're seeing is that your role in culture is changing. You're finding that where Christianity was popular, it's now unpopular. We're taking a stand, I believe, used to be very easy, and now it's very difficult. And the reality is America has gone from being one of the largest Christian nations in the world to become one of the largest mission fields in the world. And while not all questions about our future have been answered, we know that we have a wonderful relationship with our Heavenly Father who can lead us and guide us and direct us into the future. So being a Christian in today's world is different. The fact that we're in the world is true. But what we need to understand is much of the world has got into us. And what are we going to do about that? But Jesus has given us a command to be world changers. And this is still the binding command on us today. In America today, more and more people are saying they have no religious affiliation. And that has become very, very difficult for us as a church to say, this is the true way to go, because they don't believe that we have absolute truth. In America today, only 17% of people worship in a Christian church weekly, and in many regions of the country, including California, it is under 10. So as I look at this message, I want to give you a quick overview of American history. And I want to give you different eras and how Christianity and culture has shifted and what it means to us today. I want to take you back to 1607 because this gives us a clue as to the birth of these colonies, which by 1776 were going to start becoming the nation of America. And when these colonies got going and got started, Christianity was the established religion of the society. And America was founded on the premise of having faith in God. It was, in many respects, a religion of the people, for the people, and by the people. And the origins of the nation found Christianity well established. The government paid, and I have seen many churches that were built during that era. The government paid to build the actual church buildings. The government paid for their pastors and their priests. Did you know that a man could be fined the equivalent of a day's wages if for other than illness he was not in attendance on church on Sunday? And by the time America was founded in 1776, that was the established pattern in which the Declaration of Independence was written. But it took time for that pattern to change. And the reason I say that Christianity was the established culture of America until 1833 was because that was the last year in which the government paid a pastor. It was the last time government funds were used to build a church. And so we have this beginning era. So when you hear people say America was founded on Christian principles, it is true. It really was. Now, from 1833, from that time to 1918, you find a shift where Christianity was not established, but it was still predominant. Approximately 90% of people attended church on a regular basis. People like Judson, you've heard of Judson Press, and some of your Sunday school curriculum has come from there. People like Judson and others who were believers but not Anglican in their religious experience or expression, wanted to have different forms of worship. And the doctrine of the separation of church and state began, and you start of many different denominations during that time frame, and the freedom of religion happened. And the vast majority of culture attended church weekly, and it wasn't until the end of the Second World War that this era closed and the war changed America. And from 1918 to 1968, Christianity changed from the dominant culture to the subdominant culture. It was during this era that church attendance began to slip, and for the first time in American history, less than 50% of the population attended church on a regular basis. You see, Christian values after the First World War ended started to wane. The influence of European excesses started to be felt. Some of you remember an era called the Roaring Twenties. And that was a reflection of the shift of values. In this era, sin began to be redefined. It was no longer called committing adultery. It was called having an affair or a love tryst or whatever you want. But sin began to be redefined. In that time, violence began to increase. John Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King, the Kent State riots, Bobby Kennedy's assassination. In fact, the 60s themselves were the most violent decade in American history apart from the Civil War. An amazing time in America as the culture began to shift. And what we found is some things occurred in society as it related to the church. Some of you may remember the issue of God is dead. The church is irrelevant. Those voices began to be heard. The actual censoring of films stopped during that time. Up until that time, in Clark Gable's film, Gone with the Wind, there was cultural shock that the word damn should be used. Well, now you know by the time you reach the end of 1968, we didn't censor hardly anything because that had changed. Many denominations shrunk by 30 to 60%, including the American Baptists, of which we were part. And this was the first era where there were fewer churches serving the population than there were in previous generation. And the moral drift was seen in a song by Peter, Paul, and Mary. The answer now is blowing in the wind. Organizations like the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family started to come up trying to stem the tide. Now, as we went through that decade of the 60s and that period of time where Christianity became subdominant, we now found that by 1988, Christianity was counter to the culture. The majority of culture was non-Christian. Redefining of sin became commonplace. The sense of conscience eroded. Looking at truth as absolute was commonplace. But the despair in culture went up. Music reflected that despair. For example, I'll give you one example of a song. The Horse with No Name. The Horse with No Direction. And that was a reflection of the despair that was found in society, as society has lost its moorings to a sense of absolutes and spiritual roots. By the time we reach 1998, we find that not only as Christianity shifted from being counter to the culture, we find that it becomes antithetical to the culture. Columbine, for example, 1999, shocked the nation. Bernal, who was killed for her faith, she is said to be the first martyr of a person for their Christian faith in America, on American soil, since 1542, where a Catholic missionary, Juan Padilla, seeking to take the gospel to Indians in Kansas, was slain. In the Columbine story, and you can read the book, She Only Said Yes. When these two young men went in and started shooting, they went down and they said and they asked the question, are you a Christ follower or are you a Christian? And when the Christian kids said yes, they were shot. They were killed for their faith. And I want to tell you that that kind of antithetical culture to Christianity, you find out that additional church fires and church shootings and other things have started to increase as the church is antithetical to culture. Even in our state, it is not seen as something absolutely essential to our culture. And so the influence of the church in culture has waned. We have gone from having one church for every 900 people to one church for every 2,500 people. And so from the current time, 2014 to the present, 8 of 10 evangelical Christians claim that they have had some persecution of their faith or their faith position. There have been laws established as a political deal trying to outlaw church behavior and church activities. And freedom of religion is in our culture today being reinterpreted as a freedom from religion. And some of you have seen many of the recent things where much of the platform of people is that they want to see religion removed from society. And so we are living in a world where the influence of our teaching and our values has eroded. And we as a church need to be seen as a community of missionaries needed to reach this culture with the gospel. Now, the majority of Americans still believe that there is a God, 80%, for example, but only 56% believe that the God in the Bible is the God that should be believed in. And of the people who believe the God of the Bible is the God they should believe in, half of them don't believe that everything in the Bible is true. And so what we do is we have an erosion of absolute truth that God ordains in His Word, and we're finding ourselves in a world that is still far from God. Now, there's a variety of ways we can handle this. We can just stand in opposition to culture. We can get out there and wave our flag and get out there and we can protest and do what we want. Or, as some people do, they just compromise and capitulate to culture. Some people just believe that the church should sit as an example above the world and we should seek to avoid it. And others believe that we should be in it but find themselves compromised by it. But I want to take you to Billy Graham, and I think he has the right approach here. He says the church should be engaged, yet it should transcend culture. It should be engaged and transcend culture. The two dangers: we can be engaged but not transcending, and we can be transcending but not engaged. I want to show you a picture, and I want to spotlight this picture, and I want to take me down. Phenomenal feat of engineering. The Japanese company that built this bridge built it to cross the Choluteca River. But when Hurricane Mitch came, Hurricane Mitch destroyed the nation. And it was so powerful that it moved the river. The Japanese company was proud of their bridge, that it withstood the hurricane, but the problem is it is now a bridge to nowhere. It is now a bridge that goes nowhere. And we are somewhat, as a church, like the Choluteca Bridge. A storm culturally has come. And sometimes we feel like we are in a situation where a culture has moved so much that we don't even understand how we should handle it. Well, that's a good illustration, and I want to just explore that theme with you for a couple of minutes as we look on. I want you to first understand that there would be nothing better for America than more people become Christians. Christianity shifts culture for the better because of something called rise and lift. What does that mean? When you become a Christian, your life changes. You become more loving, you become more kind, you do more good, you work harder. These are the core values that become part of people who are Christians. And as those values erode in culture, when people become Christians, those values are rebuilt. So there is nothing better for America than more people become Christians. But because our culture has shifted, we need to stop saying, would you just stay in our church or would you come to our church? We need to start thinking like Jesus has said, would you go? Now I want to show you another picture here. And this is called the blue ocean and the red ocean. Now perhaps you've never seen this before, but I want to just show you to it. These two oceans really reflect two thoughts. The red ocean, you'll notice it's red because there's blood in the water and the sharks are feeding. It looks at the blue ocean and it looks like, well, there's got to be lots of fish out there in that ocean. Nobody's fishing there. The sharks aren't feeding there. And you have these two oceans. Well, here is the picture that helps with the analogy. What we find is the red ocean is where the church is. And the people who are in the red ocean are all those who are washed in the blood, who are the people who are already Christians. And we find ourselves as a church often competing with other churches for the people who are already in the red ocean. And yet, we know that 90% of our population is in the blue ocean. And who's fishing there? Oh, there might be a strange fisherman once in a while, but certainly not the majority. And so I would suggest to you this. You and I are living in a mission field. You and I are living in a mission field where there is great opportunity. The unrest in our world, while disconcerting, creates opportunities. And I would say, as someone who came to America as an immigrant, America's founding dream is fragile. I have watched it start to erode. And when we lose our understanding of what it means to be one nation under God, we will find some other laws or rules to be under. Our country is in need of God's intervention because the mooring pole to which we have been moored has been taken out. And it is very important that we not only hold on to absolute truth, but we live absolute truth. So a couple of thoughts about July 4th and what it means. Your personal freedom and my personal freedom starts in a relationship with our Heavenly Father. If you don't have a relationship with God today, I want to encourage you to get into that relationship. Admit the fact that you've lost your mooring, that you've lost your way. Believe that Jesus Christ does provide God's answer for you and commit your life to Him. And as Christians, it is important that we have that relationship with God out of which the river of life begins to flow. And when our relationship with God begins to drift, then our society begins to drift. Make it a commitment today that by the time you get to Christmas, you can honestly say, I am more in love with Jesus than I was 6 months ago. I am more in love with Jesus. You see, sometimes in our life, we become like the church in Laodicea where we're lukewarm. And our passion and love for Jesus drops. And it is the testimony of our life transformed that will make the difference in our world. I want to encourage you to make it a goal today that you'll fall in love with Jesus more and more than you have ever done before, and that change will make a difference in your life. I wish you all God's best and all God's blessing. Let me pray for you as we close today. Father, I just want to thank you for this church. Lord, 100 years seeking to be good news to the community of Taft. Bless it. Thank you for the people that are in it. Lord, may your Spirit guide and direct, and Lord, may you help all of us to fall more in love with you each and every day. And we give you praise for what you're going to do in Jesus' strong name. And we all say, Amen.